This
is Democracy,
a podcast that explores the interracial, intergenerational, and intersectional
unheard voices living in the world's
most influential democracy.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. Today's episode focuses on a topic that is ever present in the news, and even more so recently, college admissions. And the various questions surrounding college admissions in terms of access, inequality, cheating, and various other issues. Does our process allow for democratic access to higher education for citizens? And if it doesn't, how can we improve our system of college admissions in the United States? We have with us today really a remarkable guest, someone I've gotten to know in the last few months. Her name is Renee Gadsden. She's been a leader in higher education for nearly a decade. It's amazing because she's so young, but yet she's been a leader for so long. She's worked at admissions at 3 different private liberal arts colleges, directing and implementing recruitment initiatives and college access programming for students of color, for first-generation students, and students from low-income families. While she's been doing all of that, Renee recently completed a master's in public affairs at the LBJ School, and she was a leader around these exact issues at the LBJ School and at the University of Texas, where she served as an executive board member of the Public Affairs Alliance for Communities of Color and as an elected student representative of the Faculty Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So Renee's been in the trenches, so to speak, in questions of access in higher education. Renee, it's great to have you here.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. We will start, of course, with a scene-setting poem from Mr. Zachary Suri. Zachary, what's the title of your poem?
Knowledge.
Knowledge. Okay, let's hear it.
I have known since the age of 5 where I wanted to learn for 4 years under looming architecture dedicated to the study of ancient stars and modern literature. Though they have changed with time, the fusillades of Yale, Harvard, Stanford have flown mellifluous with the years. And yet there is another who cannot imagine, cannot even think of going, ignores it with the strong belief that it is too impossible, though they know all that is possible in the realm of the human mind, know every fact, every word in the dictionary. But not even the thought of college is allowed to occasionally pay a visit to their mind, kept away by the conventions of a broken system. And I have set foot on more campuses than could be listed. I have known the feeling of a cold lecture hall from my first breaths, have known the feeling of the grass on so many a historic hill, have known the people, the words, the heart of so many places that most could only dream of in the most delirious state of slumber. Yet there is someone who may live in my city, my school district, may breathe the same air, see the same stars, who has not even daydreamt of touching that soil of 1,000 scholars, and cannot even imagine sitting under the shadow of the halls of famous men and sipping from the well of wisdom. And yet we are expected to write the same letters, the same essays, the same dedications to teenage naivete, though they are supposed to do it all with second-hand notebooks on library computers. Well, I can type my first drafts on clean MacBooks under the watchful eye of a tutor who knows the inner workings of a broken system.
Zachary, it seems your poem is about inequality. What is your main point here?
Well, the main point of my poem is how in one area of our society there's a lot of privilege and wealth around college admissions, and people like myself who have had the privilege of knowing what a college is like and knowing what college is and that they want to go to college for so long, while those who are not as privileged are not even given the opportunity to really think about themselves in a college setting. But yet at the same time they're expected to do the same thing and have the same skill level on paper as everyone else. And I think that that's something that's really unequal, because when you have people being judged based on things they can't control, it's a real problem.
It's as if some start out with so many advantages and others don't. Well, Renee, that seems like the appropriate place to turn to you. Why is it that our college admissions process, and for that matter, even admissions processes for high schools and various things, seem to be going in the wrong direction with less diversity rather than more diversity? What are the challenges that we face?
Sure. So I don't want to dismiss the fact that efforts have been made, and I think there is data that does show that there has been progress, but as I'm a firm believer that there's always more work to be done. I mean, there's a lot more work that can be done. So I'll start there. I think that a lot of the challenges are beyond the walls of an institution as well. I think it's what's happening in the community. Zachary, you nicely talked about, and again, those inequalities, privileges that people have access to resources, let's say, right, that I think happen outside of school. A lot of times in the K through 12 space, we talk a lot about, how can we bring in the whole family, the whole community. When we're thinking about food security, when you're thinking about health, when you're thinking about transportation, there's a lot of different factors that do overlap that contribute, I think, to some of these, disparities.
And you talk about the efforts that have been made, and certainly they've been extraordinary, and you were working firsthand on this. But why is it that they seem to fail to compensate for some of these structural issues? What are the things we're missing?
So in terms of like the college level, I still feel like testing is a huge challenge. There has been a lot of attempts, at least since I've worked in admissions, to provide test prep for students, for Black and Brown communities, for first generation communities, and low income communities. At least in the 10 years that I've worked in admissions, I have actually seen growth in test preparation through community-based organizations. So there has been growth in that area, but again, that is external outside of, let's say, your traditional public school.
Right.
And the reason for that is in the traditional public school, your guidance counselor's main role is counseling, not necessarily college preparation. So they're dealing a lot with more of that socio-emotional in the school as opposed to that college preparation. Mm-hmm. So oftentimes these CBOs will come in and either partner with schools or be a separate entity to provide exactly that, this college access. How do you navigate that, college trajectory and that journey?
And CBOs are college board officers?
CBOs are community-based organizations.
Community-based organizations.
That's correct.
So they come in to try to provide test prep and things of that sort to substitute for the support that a lot of students don't get otherwise.
And they can be internal or they're external. They tend to be their own nonprofit, so 501c3s often.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Gotcha. And is part of the problem that those coming out of disadvantaged communities don't understand the process, don't know, for example, that there's financial aid available? There have been studies showing that people under-apply from certain communities for financial aid. Is that still a major issue?
I would say yes and no. I'm sure there are definitely some families that maybe do not necessarily know the whole process, but I think we are getting to a place where families do know the process, especially with the common application, making it a lot easier. It's one application, so you apply it everywhere. And again, with the growth of these community-based organizations, these college access organizations, I think the word is out there. Libraries do a really good job of communicating that. So I think all communities now are becoming more of a college-going culture, or at least aspiring to that, or want to.
That's great.
But Zachary's poem, I think you said it best, is that even though a student may want to, do they have that same access to it, I think is really where we're switching the conversation. Right. In terms of, and I think I missed the second part of your question.
So, what are the things that are making it harder for people to learn about the information they need to have?
Sure. So, I think they have the information, but the financial aid is what I definitely wanted to address. So, with the financial aid, the FAFSA is a convoluted form. Right. It's complicated.
This is the standard form everyone has to complete.
It is a standard form in order to get aid. And I'm happy we're bringing this up because when we think about admissions, I think oftentimes we just think about the application itself when we forget about the rest of the process. Because once you can get admitted. Students are admitted, no matter their background. They are admitted, but affordability is a huge part of that process. And FAFSA is another component. And there's been a lot of conversations about how do you make the FAFSA form easier when you're thinking about tax forms. getting tax forms is hard when
Sure.
you are a teenager and you're responsible for filling out these forms by yourself.
Right.
And a lot of times, if you will, a big barrier to FAFSA is you have to have both guardians fill out information. But if you are a student, let's say, who does not have a relationship with one of your parents and they have not been in your life at all and you have not communicated with them,
Right.
how do you get that information?
Right.
But you have to get that information
Really?
or else you will not get your financial aid award.
Right. So in a sense, they're bureaucratic barriers that probably hinder certain communities more than others.
It can.
Now, there's an ongoing debate about affirmative action, of course. First of all, as someone who has watched the process for 10 years or more, what is your assessment of affirmative action? What works well? What doesn't work well? How should we think about this? It's obviously about ongoing court cases surrounding this as well.
Yeah. So with affirmative action, in the work that I've done, we always have a holistic process. So I've never had to see personally, at least in the work that I've done, the pros and cons of affirmative action, because all the schools I've ever worked for were always a holistic process. So we looked at test scores. I would look at, context of where a student is from. So I think, that has always been, at least in my career, on the forefront of making sure we're looking at the whole student.
Right.
To try our very best and making sure that we're, providing equitable access to higher education. I think in terms of studies that I have read, there's mixed outcomes and there's mixed feelings about whether affirmative action is doing what it has intended to do. I think there are some studies that have shown, yes, it is working, but it depends on the competitive level of the institution. I think there's also those that have said, no, it's not working. But again, these are empirical studies and
Right.
there will be different outcomes depending on that.
But what do you say to the student who applies from one background and has higher test scores, let's say, and higher grades, but then someone from a disadvantaged background who has lower test scores and lower grades is admitted? I mean, this happens quite often.
Sure.
And that's often where you get these claims of unfairness
Yeah.
by those who have been denied a seat to someone who on paper, just on terms of scores, might look like they're less qualified. How do you think about that? How do you justify the holistic process in that context?
Sure. So, and that's why holistic review is so important, is because context is everything.
Right.
And for instance, if a student has, to your example, if you have a student from, let's say, a more affluent background
Right.
that comes from a more affluent community with more resources, who does have top scores. I mean, I have read applications from both communities. So I'll have a student who is from a affluent community who has that top scores,
Right.
but so does everyone else in their community.
Right.
So is that really differentiating them and how they took advantage and led in their community? And I think that is what you're looking at in terms of the difference, because a student that may have the lower, let's say, SAT score and maybe slightly lower GPA, but maybe they took all of the APs offered at their school.
Right.
Maybe they were still taking the most challenging curriculum that was afforded to them,
Right.
as well as, helping mom at home after school with the siblings and having some family responsibilities,
Right.
as well as, the athletics or the film or a job.
Right.
I think
Right.
leadership looks different depending on where your background and your personal responsibilities.
This is your point about context. It could be
Yeah.
a student who has a slightly lower GPA but has been working full time while taking a whole slew of AP courses versus someone who has a higher GPA but hasn't been working.
Exactly.
Who looks more impressive in that context, right?
Right.
Zachary, you had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering what students do, get on campus. What is being done to make students from disadvantaged backgrounds feel more welcome on campuses?
That's a really great question. So some schools will have specific, well, first they'll have orientation, right? And a lot of colleges will do orientation to get students acclimated. A lot of the student organizations, a lot of affinity groups. So let's say like multicultural student organizations or Black student organizations, let's say, will come together and either, mentor and kind of be a community within a community. I think the best colleges are the ones that have communities within communities, especially for, our students of color, our low-income students,
Yes.
and our first-generation students. I have known some colleges to even have offices that work specifically with first-generation students, right, and really tackle those intersectionalities of identity head on. And I think that's super important because just because you are African American, let's say, doesn't necessarily mean you're first generation.
Right.
And share that, same commonality. Other ways is some students will have preparation. So let's say depending, and this doesn't necessarily mean anything about your personal identity, but if there's, your math maybe is not necessarily up to where it needs to be, then they'll give you that extra, a combination of extra support in that area in your first year, right? Because your first year is critical, freshman year, making sure that you get acclimated socially, but as well as academically. And then also like mentorship, making sure that students know where your safe place is on campus that you can go to ask those questions, to learn how to navigate, to learn how to, approach your professors because that's scary, and some students just don't know, hey, how do I have a conversation with my professor? How do I maximize this opportunity and build that relationship?
So there's so many things that you've been a part of, so many programs that are clearly making a difference and making an effort, and that's a really positive story. But still, it's hard as an educator not at times to feel like there's still a huge gap. Two examples, of course, University of Texas, right here. We're in a state that will soon be majority minority, but you wouldn't know that on our campus, for example. And another example, my high school in New York City that we've talked about a few times on this podcast, Stuyvesant High School, recently admitted more than 700 students. This is one of the magnet schools in New York to their new class, of which 9 were African Americans. And this is in a city where African Americans and Latinos and Latinas are, I think, almost a majority, if not a majority, of the public school system. So the gaps still seem to be really large, in spite of all these efforts that you've described so well, Renee. Why is that?
I feel that we need to humanize some of these processes a little bit more. I think, we have the data. I think, looking at economics, looking at empirical evidence is great. But let's not forget that students are humans too.
Right.
And I think more can be done to make the process more personalized. I think the best schools, I think the schools that do best at this work
Yes.
are the ones who really take the time to recruit our, multicultural students, to recruit our first generation intentionally and head on and purposefully, and with a lot of heart. And I think, understanding that as an admissions counselor, let's say, the counselor piece really needs to shine.
Yes.
To build a relationship with families. And that is really key to really making the difference. And if that means, you're funding a family to visit your school,
Right.
then, trying to find that and to make it happen, funding is a huge component.
Sure.
I think I've always said, the students that we're talking about today are the cream of the crop. When you're thinking about a high achieving student who is, looking to make themselves better and do better for the world and be part of the community, these are the cream of the crop students. Your institution is not the only institution that wants that student.
Right,
So the
right.
way you're recruiting an athlete should be the same way that you're recruiting a student of color, a first generation student, or a low income student. The same efforts and the same amount of funding should be put into that.
It sounds very much parallel what you're describing. Of course, that takes an enormous amount of resources.
Yes.
And do you find that schools are willing to do that?
I do feel that schools are willing to do that. I do, but I feel that some may be reluctant, because at the end of the day, schools are, they're businesses too.
Of course.
Right? So we have to sustain. And I may be going to a different direction, but it is slightly, it is related. One thing that I have learned and has slightly bothered me a bit is how exactly this. I have, in my career, my early 20s, I had, very influential and, whatever someone, taught me, I'm like, okay, yes, this is the way.
Right.
And the rhetoric that's used, you buy into it a little bit when you're learning something. So it was, in order to recruit, my students, and I say my students because
Sure.
I was a multicultural recruitment coordinator, we have to also recruit full pays because the full pays pay for, the rhetoric was full pays pay for your low income students.
Okay.
So that's embedded, right, in us. We need the full pays, but now it still is this white savior complex almost.
Okay.
And I have a huge problem with that because I feel like it takes dignity away from the community by saying that one community is paying for
Right.
the other.
Right.
So in addition, there's also this. We say, when we are recruiting multicultural students, low-income students, or first-generation students, it's diversity. We coin them, it's adding diversity. If we do this, it's adding value. So there's a return on the investment for the community that already exists here. Mm-hmm. It's never a rhetoric of the other way around. We only tell the story one way.
Yes.
In my opinion, it should be, we're doing this because this community deserves it.
Right.
And we have a civic duty to do so.
Right.
And that should be the value add, not that, hey, and it happens in corporate America as well.
Sure,
when you think about it,
sure.
they talk about, let's do diversity and recruitment, chief
Sure.
diversity officers, so that, and it proves that we'll get higher revenues, higher
Right,
profits.
right.
Instead of, no, people just deserve these positions because they're equally as good,
Right.
if not better.
This is what you mean by humanizing the process, right?
Yes.
People don't want to be seen as the instruments to someone else's agenda. They actually want to be seen as students, as people who are cared about by the institution that cares to and invests in educating them.
Yes.
Right. And that's often not the way this is discussed, even by defenders of affirmative action, right?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I would say so.
Zachary, you had a question?
I was wondering how the process is different and how you think the process for recruiting multicultural and first-generation students should be when we're talking about like a bigger school like UT, which really can't go out and recruit like individual students. It can't go out and recruit all of its students as individuals. They have to have like a larger pool. How do you prevent the privilege of others from hijacking the process and making it about who has the best grades on paper and less about what the process should really be about?
Right, when the numbers are so large.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I would push back a little bit and say a school like UT can absolutely do it, right? They do it with their athletes, so why
Right.
couldn't they do it
Right.
for a population that we need to serve, right? And do right by. So I would push against that a little bit and say that it is absolutely possible. I think it is a power of building relationships and choosing, again, the mission process starts with recruitment.
Yeah.
Where are you choosing to recruit? I have had colleagues, not necessarily in the offices I've worked for, but when you travel, you meet other admission counselors. And I have met people that say, I don't go to that school because there's metal detectors. Well, now you are hindering an opportunity for a student to come to your institution because you refuse to go to certain schools because of,
Right.
the environment, let's say, right? And I don't think that's fair.
Right.
And, again, you're limiting access. So I think, where are you spending your resources, even when you're traveling?
Yes.
Because that can still be done at a large scale, and it still is individualized. If I'm in an auditorium speaking with students, because you are visiting at least 5 schools a day when you're traveling,
Wow.
at least 5 schools. These are hour visits. So you can absolutely do it depending on how you're allocating your time. What we would do as multicultural recruitment coordinators, I was part of a community up north, is in terms of strategy, what we would try to do is, if your, let's say, multicultural population at your university was, 15%, just throwing numbers out there, then you should aim that 15% of your travel every year should be targeted towards that demographic, whether it's by, school,
Sure.
Building relationships with community-based organizations. 15% or more should be dedicated to that.
Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that there's an even deeper point you're making, which is so important, which is that a school like UT should be involved in these communities beyond recruitment, right? One of the ways that universities recruit athletes is they build long-term relationships with coaches and with programs at the high school level. One could do that academically more than we do. Most universities don't spend a lot of time investing in actually connecting their professors and connecting the academic programming with a lot of communities that are non-traditional. And so if programs are in those communities more often, then those communities are likely to feel more connected to the university, more comfortable applying, and that makes the job of an admissions officer, it seems to me, more humane, right?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm not sure exactly what, UT does or doesn't do in terms of, who they're connected with, but I imagine like things like Project Mails.
Exactly.
I mean, that is one way that I think UT does stay connected in the community.
Right.
And I think, that's brilliant, being able to be a reference and a resource,
Yes.
not just an admissions counselor, not
Right.
just a recruiter, is extremely important. Being able to get out in the community and provide, essay writing workshops, or, how to fill out the common application, or how to fill out any college application for that matter, and really walking families through what each section is and how it is reviewed and why it's valuable for the process is extremely helpful, because these are the kinds of things that an affluent community is getting.
Right.
That maybe, non-affluent communities, aren't getting, and they're not getting that same insight. And if mom and dad or brother and sister didn't go through the process, and maybe they did, but it was a long time ago, and maybe it wasn't for like a full-time kind of higher education program, then it's going to look a lot different.
Sure. What's your thought on admissions counselors, especially, this is quite controversial now, surrounding obviously some evidence that wealthy families have been using admissions counselors to, in a sense, bribe their way or cheat their way in. What is your experience with these private admissions consultants?
So I have not had those. What's in the news now? I have not had necessarily those sorts of experiences.
I hope not.
No, I've never been bribed. I haven't had situations where we've been bribed. I mean, we definitely have parents, and I haven't necessarily dealt with like consultants really pushing that envelope too much. Parents definitely advocate for their kids a lot, and it is going to be, from the families who have been through this process many a times before, where they're calling on behalf of, their child and that sort of thing, and maybe trying to push the envelope, but not as far as like a bribe.
Mm-hmm. But it's your job in admissions to push back, right, and not allow.
It is. I mean, I've had, moms call and just say, definitely made some discriminatory comments. And yes, you have to put your foot down as an admission counselor and explain, no, this student, no matter their background, belongs here.
Right.
Belongs here. They deserve to be here. No one's taking anyone's spot. That is not how this process works.
Right. So I guess our last question, Renee, this has been a fascinating conversation. Our last question, sort of looking forward, is how can our listeners help this process to become more inclusive while also playing the game as they have to? I mean, that's the dilemma, right? So whether you're a parent or you're a student or wherever you are, you have to play the game. Yeah. Because you want the best access you can have, and that's the obligation you have to yourself. But while playing the game, how can we still encourage the process to become more inclusive and highlight some of the positive elements that we clearly need more of? How can we make it more humane while we're succeeding at it?
Absolutely. So First and foremost, I mean, heart. I mean, first, just lead with heart, lead with passion, lead with heart, right? And lead with love. I think that's really the first and foremost, because this is a very stressful process. And I think if anything, when you lead with love, it makes it a little bit easier to deal with maybe rejection if you had, because you can't admit everyone. And not that it's easy, but it's just, it's from a good place, right? And there's nothing necessarily malicious about these processes. At the end of the day, to the parents and the guardians and to students, know that colleges care. I know the media is maybe posing some colleges as, the evil here, but they're not always that way. It seems that way sometimes, but they really have their hearts in the right place, taking the steps in the right direction. There are limits to what an institution can do and how many students an institution can take in, but remembering that, that's important in order to provide the best opportunity. Size is important. So you don't want to have over enroll, because then it can impact your experience.
Exactly.
So lead with heart. I think for counselors, I would recommend to really make that extra effort to go out there and to go into the communities that maybe you're not familiar with and learn more about it. Especially if it's not a community, that you're from. Talk with the counselors, talk with the families, eat at the local restaurants, especially since the school's paying for your lunch that day. Maybe, just explore a little bit, walk around, because I think once you need to really immerse yourself in the community to understand, and also be patient, because it can take up to 3 to 5 years to build a relationship with a new school or a new community-based organization or a new community. And then, for the students, continue to be you and share your story. Share your story in your application. When you're meeting admissions counselors, when you're on college campuses, share your story. If you feel like you're standing out in a community, it's because you are glowing, and you belong there. And continue to ask questions. I think more students can ask more questions. I think people are scared to ask questions, but as admissions counselors, we like questions.
Yes.
We love questions. And there's no such thing as a stupid question.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Zachary, is this helpful for you to think about the process as you see it, and also your moral commitments that you laid out so well in your poem? Is this helpful?
Yes, I really do think that there's that for myself specifically, but also for people my age, that there is a lot of reckoning around the college admissions process and recognizing that it's not fair necessarily, and that it's not a perfect system, but that also we need to do our best to reform the system, that we can't just let it be. But at the same time, I do think that, on the other hand, there's a lot of ignorance among people about how it affects others, especially when it comes to people personally. People on a large scale are happy to say that they're all for a fair process and that the system is broken, but when it comes to them individually not being admitted, then they're very angry when an affirmative action policy keeps them out. Right. And I think that's something that we all need to reckon with if we actually want to have a better system.
And understand the process as a whole, and not just see it about one individual. There's a set of humane commitments I think we have to have throughout this. Renee and Zachary, I think you've given us so many insights here. Most important of all, I think, is recognizing the hard work that goes into making a process that by its nature has to make choices, difficult choices, making this process as inclusive and as humane as possible. And perhaps one of the lessons for today is that we tend to speak or focus too much on just outcomes without understanding how we get to those outcomes, and without understanding more clearly what it takes to actually build a process that brings more people in. This is a long-term commitment, one where a new generation will have to make some of its own difficult choices going forward. Thank you for your insights, Renee. Thank you, Zachary. This has been another wonderful episode of This is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts Development Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harrison Lemke, and you can find his music at harrisonlemke.com.
Subscribe and stay tuned for a new episode every Thursday featuring new perspectives on democracy.